Bureaucracies grow increasingly present in daily life, but few people truly understand what bureaucracies are, and even fewer realize that bureaucracies create a significant failure point in our infrastructure, a failure point that could easily be catastrophic. Whether it's job applications, university admissions, or something as simple as sending an email to the right person, bureaucracy has complicated what should otherwise be simple tasks. And with each passing day, as technology progresses and becomes ever the more difficult to understand, bureaucracy increases its sphere of influence, taking on more and more responsibility for managing infrastructure. Yet, despite this omnipresence in contemporary life, little analysis has been done in order to answer the question of what bureaucracy really is. What analysis that does exist ignores the nefarious goals of bureaucracy. The claim I make in this video is that bureaucracy is not just a neutral byproduct of an advanced civilization, but a system intentionally created by those in power in order to retain that power for as long as possible. How can this be? First, we must start from the accepted definition of bureaucracy. At the most fundamental level, a bureaucracy is a form of government run primarily by unelected civil servants. This definition is vague and limited. It applies only to governments rather than any substantial organization, and it fails to capture the nature of what a bureaucrat is in terms of character and personality. A better definition is an organization or institution that is controlled by bureaucrats, where a bureaucrat is an individual whose primary responsibility is to manage that which already exists, as opposed to innovating or inventing, by artificially inflating the amount of work that needs to be done. The impetus for creating such a system is the stagnation and controlled transfer of power from high-rank bureaucrats to low-rank bureaucrats. This is the first of three principles that characterize all bureaucracies. The second principle is the creation of artificial work, which is perhaps what bureaucracies are most known for. And the third principle is the selective admittance of individuals into the bureaucracy. The second and third principles serve to fulfill the first, which, as I mentioned, is the primary motive for the existence of bureaucracies. By creating artificial work and passing it off as being necessary, bureaucrats are able to prevent power from readily being shifted between different groups and individuals, thereby giving them control of entire systems of infrastructure. It's not a coincidence that the needs of a bureaucrat often take precedence over all other considerations within an organization. This artificiality is what separates an ordinary organization with rules and procedures from a bureaucratic one. Once they have firmly established their influence, power can then be handed down from high-ranking bureaucrats to their lower-ranking beneficiaries, creating a controlled chain of succession that repeats for as long as the bureaucracy exists and ensures that power remains securely within its bounds. But if the bureaucracy is to survive, the power cannot be passed down to just anyone, which is where the third principle comes into play. Only those individuals who are certain to continue the work and efforts of the bureaucracy are allowed to become members at all. Anyone that could potentially cause disruption to the carefully laid out structure of rules, policies, and codes that allow the bureaucracy to function is disqualified from joining. This is achieved by carefully vetting the individual seeking entry, without them ever realizing it. Their character, personality, and views are inspected so as to ascertain whether they are like-minded and malleable. This is most often accomplished through inconspicuous means, such as interviews, surveys, or tests. These three principles, when taken together, form the basis of bureaucracy. Perhaps the best example of these principles in action is in human resources, otherwise known as HR. HR managers spend the vast majority of their time doing work that is artificially generated by other bureaucrats. This includes creating new policies from old policies, defining and maintaining corporate values, and ensuring that the automated systems that do their work for them continue to operate. What little actual work they do is in recruitment and hiring. However, this is only because the third principle necessitates it. The pedantic hiring process is a surreptitious way of vetting recruits, not just for the purposes of employment, but more crucially, to guarantee that they will do as they're told, and to prepare them for becoming bureaucrats themselves. HR controls policy, pay, and people, which allows them to congregate power within themselves. When the time comes, this power is easily transferred to their beneficiaries, who they themselves hired. Thus, all three principles are put to use. As I've stated before, infrastructure constitutes the foundation of society. The foundation of infrastructure, then, are the principles and techniques of mathematics, science, and design, or more generally, architecture and engineering. The main issue arises from the fact that bureaucracies attempt to manage and maintain infrastructure using a system of procedural and administrative means that build on themselves infinitely. This creates an ultra complex system whose inner workings become lost to individual bureaucrats themselves. This is the ultimate danger in allowing bureaucrats to manage infrastructure. If something physically breaks, no bureaucrat possesses the technical understanding and skill to fix it on his own initiative. And because the system they have created is so unnecessarily complex, it takes more time, money, and labor than it should to get someone who can actually resolve the issue. The worst case scenario, if something critical breaks, say for instance the power grid for an entire city, delays in fixing it could trigger a chain reaction of failure that could take weeks, months, or even years to repair. From the perspective of the bureaucrat, that's precisely the point, stagnating power through artificial delays. But for the rest of us, it results in an extremely fragile society. Worse yet, if an actor has malicious intent, bureaucracies serve as excellent points of entry to infiltrate infrastructure and wreak havoc. Most data breaches aren't caused by IT failures, but by social engineering. Aside from systems failing, the latent effect of bureaucracy is the diminishment of construction quality and standards. Bureaucracies favor top down, policy based approaches which create benefits upstream but not downstream. The consequence: cheap buildings constructed with layers of material hastily glued together that readily come apart when they reach their lifespan. If you've ever looked around at contemporary structures and compared them to ancient ones, you'll have noticed a stark difference in mass and weight. Namely, historical structures tend to have both, whilst contemporary structures tend not to. They lack firmitas, durability, particularly in their expression. The fact that our homes nowadays are composed of little more than drywall, studs, insulation, house wrap, and siding is, to an extent, a physical manifestation of bureaucracy. The home itself has been reduced into a procedure, a series of steps that is easily scalable and replicable. And of course, structures built in this manner are effortless to pass through zoning regulations and building codes, meaning less actual work for the bureaucrat. Given such problems, one would anticipate that other thinkers have voiced similar concerns. On the contrary, thinkers that have analyzed bureaucracy give it more charity than it deserves, and their analyses are always top down. That's because these thinkers are often academics, sociologists, economists, etc. In other words, they are themselves bureaucrats, high ranking ones at that. The sociologist Max Weber asserts that bureaucracies are the most efficient and rational way to organize human activities. Granted, he also warned against the potential for an iron cage of control that would trap individuals if bureaucracies dominated. The economist Ludwig von Mises believed that bureaucracy was the only viable method for conducting government affairs. He criticized its application to corporate affairs, arguing that bureaucracy only emerges in private spheres due to government intervention. Yet, as illustrated previously, HR management is bureaucratic entirely on its own. Conversely, some individuals, in an effort to dispense with bureaucracy completely, discard the systems thinking that gives life not just to bureaucracy, but to society as well. The fundamental failing of bureaucracy is not that it is systematic, but that it is artificially systematic, and with a nefarious aim to boot. Plenty of phenomena, both natural and human, organize themselves into systems. Anatomy is an excellent example of the former, where various systems work together synergistically to provide the structure for life. Buildings too are systems, just not in the way bureaucracies make them out to be. Architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, whose philosophy of organic architecture is largely predicated on systems which are inevitable, understand this. The difference between these sorts of systems and the ones we see in bureaucracies is that of necessity. In the case of anatomical and building systems, they are necessary because of the laws of mathematics and physics. Bureaucracies, on the other hand, fail to justify the necessity of their systems, either materially, logistically, or philosophically. Given what I've said, what then is the best response on an individual scale? The person who is capable of thinking systematically and applying this towards distinctly productive and creative efforts puts himself in a position to circumvent bureaucracy. That being said, bureaucracies are incredibly clever when it comes to recruiting new members. Many productive and creative individuals start their careers with noble aims, but eventually become bureaucrats, whether they realize it or not. This goes back to the third principle of bureaucracy. Conscientious individuals are identified and subsequently conditioned through professional organizations, licensing processes, and other seemingly innocent entities to adopt the mindset of the bureaucrat as their own. Individuals who insist on producing actual work using their faculties of reason and creativity have greater protection from this conditioning. Thus, they are able to infiltrate bureaucracies and use their own methods against them without becoming bureaucrats themselves. If you want to defeat bureaucracy, it is not collective revolution that is the antidote, but individual production. To put it into a list, the three most important things you can do are maintain your intellectual sovereignty, master a creative or productive skill, and use it to create real, tangible value in the world. You'll notice that these prescriptions are almost directly antithetical to the principles of bureaucracy. That's no coincidence. Treat bureaucracy as an obstacle to overcome, and it will become a tool for your success. As a side note, because production is linked to actual work as opposed to artificial work, it is much more decentralized, rather than being congregated and distributed to members of a single institution. Power readily shifts between different creative individuals, since anyone can produce given the tools and means. That is to say, the act of producing is fundamentally accessible to all humans as an ontological fact, irrespective of what bureaucratic rules say. Because architecture as a discipline inherently rewards creativity, when architects themselves become bureaucrats, it is immediately noticeable in infrastructure. This is how you end up with gaudy McMansions, sprawling suburbs, electricity grids built like Jenga towers, stock floor plans, among other things. A bureaucracy spreads and forces itself into almost every aspect of architecture. Each of these topics warrant their own videos, and certainly I will be covering them in the future. I'll leave you with this. As you traverse contemporary society and go about your day-to-day life, take note of how bureaucracy physically manifests around you. Because while we often discuss it in a strictly philosophical sense, it is very much so tangible as well, perhaps more than we as a society would like to admit.